There's a cut on your leg. It's not deep. 2 days ago, you barely noticed it, and now you can't stop looking at it. The edges have gone soft and pale. There's a smell coming off it that you don't have a word for yet, but your body already understands. Your skin is hot. Your hands are cold. Somewhere under that wound, something is spreading, and it's moving faster than you are. Nobody has to explain the timeline to you because you've watched it happen to other people. First, the swelling, then the red line crawling up toward the hip, then the shaking, the confusion, and a body that stops answering when you speak to it. From a scratch like this, that whole process can take under a week. You have no antibiotics, no hospital, no pills, no needles, no one to call. What you have is a group of people crouched around you who have seen this exact thing 100 times before, and they already know what to do. The oldest one leans over your leg and reaches into a gourd. What comes out of it is alive. Everything in you says no. Everything in you says get away from that. And here's what you need to understand about that reaction, because it's the whole story of this video. That instinct in your gut, that clean, modern, civilized disgust, is the exact instinct that would kill you here. The thing she's holding is going to save your leg. It's also, roughly 2,000 years from now, going to be laughed out of every serious hospital on Earth, dismissed as filth, and effectively banned from medicine for most of a century. And then it's going to come back. Officially, approved, prescribed. Because here's the part almost nobody knows. When scientists finally went back and tested the things ancient humans did to stay alive, they weren't expecting much. They expected superstition, ritual, guesswork that happened to work sometimes. What they found instead was chemistry. Real, functional, repeatable chemistry, discovered without microscopes, without labs, and without a single person on Earth knowing what a bacterium was. Your ancestors weren't guessing. They were running the longest experiment in human history, and the ones who got it wrong didn't get to have children. So the question stops being, what did ancient people believe, and becomes something much more uncomfortable. What did they figure out that we threw away, and how much of it are we quietly putting back? 10 of those methods, every one of them condemned. Every one of them now backed by science. Let's start with the one crawling toward your leg. The gourd is full of maggots. She tips them onto the dead tissue at the edge of your cut, and she does it carefully, the way someone places seeds. Then she wraps the whole thing in a leaf and tells you not to touch it. Every part of you is screaming. But watch what happens over the next 3 days, because it's not what you think. The maggots don't eat you. They can't. Their mouths only handle tissue that's already dead, the gray, rotting stuff that's feeding the infection and blocking your body from closing the wound. They strip that out with the precision of a surgeon working under a magnifying glass, and they leave living flesh completely alone. That's not all they do. As they feed, they release fluid into the wound, and that fluid kills bacteria. It also softens the crust of dead material so it can be carried away, and it seems to nudge your own tissue into growing faster. Your ancestors could not have told you a word of that. What they could tell you is that people with maggots in their wounds tended to walk again, and people without them tended to lose the leg. That's all the proof anyone needed for tens of thousands of years. And it isn't only your ancestors who noticed. Military surgeons kept writing the same strange observation down, war after war, for centuries. Soldiers whose wounds had been left in the mud and had gone crawling somehow did better than the men who'd been carried straight to a clean tent. The wounds were pinker, the fever was lower, fewer of them lost limbs. Those surgeons had no idea why. They wrote it in their notes anyway, because that's what you do when the same impossible thing keeps happening in front of you. Then medicine got clean. Wounds became something you scrubbed, sealed, and sterilized. And the idea of deliberately putting insects into a human being became a symbol of everything backward and dirty about the past. Battlefield surgeons who had seen it work with their own eyes were told to stop. It got pushed out of hospitals almost entirely. Almost. In 2004, the United States Food and Drug Administration formally approved live medical maggots as a treatment. Not a folk remedy, a regulated medical device, farmed in sterile conditions, prescribed by doctors, used today on diabetic foot ulcers and wounds that antibiotics can't fix. Your great-great-grandmother's grandmother was right, and it took a federal agency to admit it. So if we were that wrong about the maggots, what else did we throw in the bin? Now imagine the wound is on your hand, and it's fresh, and there's no time to wait for anything to crawl. Someone hands you a lump of honey. It sounds soft. It sounds almost like a comfort thing, like putting sugar on a child's scrape to stop the crying. It isn't. What's about to happen to that wound is closer to chemical warfare. Honey pulls water out of everything it touches. Bacteria are mostly water, and when honey sits against them, it drags the moisture straight out through their walls until they collapse. On top of that, honey is acidic enough to make life miserable for most infections. And there's a third layer, which is the one nobody saw coming until modern labs looked closely. Certain honeys slowly release hydrogen peroxide in tiny, steady amounts, enough to kill bacteria, gentle enough not to burn the tissue trying to heal. 3 separate weapons in one sticky handful, and your ancestors found it by paying attention. Egyptian medical papyri are full of it. Wound after wound, the same 3 ingredients keep appearing: grease, plant fiber, and honey. Not as a blessing, as a dressing, applied and reapplied, like a modern nurse changing a bandage. Then came the antibiotic age, and honey looked ridiculous next to a syringe. It got filed away as a peasant remedy, the kind of thing your grandmother suggests and you politely ignore. Here's where it turns. As bacteria learned to shrug off one antibiotic after another, hospitals started running out of options, and researchers went looking through the discard pile. Today, medical-grade honey, sterilized and standardized, sits on hospital shelves in Europe, Australia, and North America as a licensed wound dressing. It works on infections that have already beaten the drugs. Bacteria can evolve around a chemical that attacks one target. They have a much harder time evolving around being physically drained dry, which raises a question that's going to keep coming back in this video. If the oldest solutions are the hardest ones for nature to defeat, why were we in such a hurry to get rid of them? Let's leave the wound for a moment, because something worse is happening. You're burning up. The fever has been climbing since last night, and your head feels like it's being squeezed from the inside. There's no pharmacy. There's no thermometer. There is a tree by the river, and the old man is already walking toward it. He strips a piece of bark and tells you to chew it. It's bitter enough to make your eyes water. 20 minutes later, the pounding behind your eyes starts to loosen its grip. That tree is a willow, and it's making a chemical called salicin as a defense against insects and disease. Your body takes that chemical apart and turns it into salicylic acid, which reduces pain, brings down fever, and calms inflammation. If that sounds familiar, it should. That is aspirin, not something like aspirin. The same working principle, straight off a branch, thousands of years before a chemist ever put it in a bottle. The old man doesn't know that. What he knows is which tree, which time of year, and how much. And that last part is not a small detail. It's the whole difference between medicine and poison. Chew too much of that bark and it tears up your stomach, which is exactly the problem chemists spent the 1800s trying to solve when they finally pulled the active compound out and softened it. What they were really doing was industrializing a piece of knowledge that had been passed hand to hand around the world for thousands of years. The same trick turns up on different continents, in groups with no contact, using whatever local tree happened to carry the same chemical. Different landscapes, same answer. That's not coincidence. That's what happens when enough people, over enough time, quietly test everything within walking distance of home. And here's the detail that should stop you cold. When scientists analyzed hardened plaque scraped off Neanderthal teeth from a cave in Spain, they found traces of poplar, another tree carrying the same pain-killing chemical, in the mouth of an individual whose jaw showed signs of a painful abscess. The plaque from that same mouth also carried signs of a mold from the Penicillium family, a sick Neanderthal chewing a painkiller, with a mold in his mouth from the same family that would eventually give humanity penicillin. We are not talking about modern humans anymore. We're talking about a different kind of human entirely, in pain, reaching for the specific plant that helps. If a Neanderthal with a rotting tooth could find the painkiller growing outside his cave, it's worth asking what else we've been too proud to look at. Subscribe now, because the next one is the trick that got people called animals. And it's the reason some of your ancestors survived poisoning. Winter has stripped the land. There's no meat, and the only food left is a pile of roots and acorns that taste wrong in a way you can't ignore. Sharp, bitter, and drying out your mouth. That bitterness is a warning. Plants build poisons to stop things like you from eating them, and eating enough of them will make you violently sick. So the woman next to you does something that would get you stared at in any modern city. She walks to a specific bank of pale clay, digs out a handful, mixes it into the food, and eats it. Not because she's starving to the point of madness, because it works. Clay particles carry a mild electrical charge, and many plant toxins carry an opposite one. Inside your stomach, they lock onto each other, and the poison gets carried straight through your body without ever being absorbed. She has effectively built herself a filter out of the ground. It isn't a one-off. It shows up across continents, in different climates, in people who never met. And it survives into the modern world, where kaolin, one of the very clays involved, has been a standard ingredient in stomach medicine sold in pharmacies. Modern nutrition looked at people eating soil and saw ignorance. Then researchers noticed which people did it most, and where, and with what foods, and the picture flipped. The pattern wasn't random at all. It clustered exactly where the diet was most likely to be toxic. Your ancestors weren't eating dirt because they didn't know better. They were eating dirt because they did. But there's a form of starvation that clay can't fix, and it's far stranger than an empty stomach. You've had a good week. You've killed and eaten every day, and your belly has been full every night. So why are you getting weaker? Your muscles ache. Your head is foggy. There's a heaviness in you that food isn't touching. You're eating, and you're still dying. This is one of the cruelest traps in survival, and it has a name that sounds harmless: rabbit starvation. Lean meat is nearly all protein, and your body can only process so much protein at once before the system that clears out the waste starts to overload. Push past that limit with nothing else in your diet, and you get sicker with every meal. Eat more, and it gets worse. The food itself becomes the problem. The fix is fat. Marrow, brain, organ meat, the greasy parts modern kitchens throw out or trim off. We know this partly because of people who learned it the hard way in living memory. Explorers and trappers in the far north kept describing the same thing in their journals: hunting well, eating constantly, and getting weaker anyway on a diet of lean game. Some of them died with meat still hanging in camp. The people already living in those places watched this happen and found it baffling, because they've been trained since childhood to eat the animal in a completely different order. And now go back and look at what ancient hunters actually did with a carcass, because it stops looking like savagery and starts looking like a strategy. Bones cracked open lengthwise for marrow, skulls opened, organs eaten first, often on the spot, sometimes before anything else. In many places, the muscle meat, the part we'd call the steak, was treated as the least valuable thing on the animal. That looks disgusting to us. It's also the difference between surviving a winter and quietly wasting away with a full stomach. Then came a century of nutrition advice telling you fat was the enemy. Trim it, skip the yolk, choose the leanest cut. Organ meat became something for other people in other countries in the past. That advice has been unraveling for years now, and researchers keep circling back to the same uncomfortable conclusion. The hunters weren't tearing into the fatty parts because they were crude. They were doing it because the alternative kills you slowly while you're still eating. But surviving hunger is one thing. Surviving what gets into your blood is another. And that's where the next one gets genuinely hard to believe. Infection is the thing that will most likely kill you in this world. Not predators, not cold, a small invisible thing that gets in through a scratch. So imagine what it would mean if your ancestors had antibiotics. They shouldn't. Antibiotics belong to the 20th century. They belong to a laboratory in London and a dish of mold and a story every school child gets told. Except when researchers examined ancient bones from Nubia in what's now Sudan, they found tetracycline, a genuine antibiotic, locked into the skeletons. Not traces from the soil, deposited in the bone the way it gets deposited when a living person takes it, again and again over years. Those people had been consuming an antibiotic centuries before anyone could have named it. The likely source was their food and drink. Certain bacteria that grow in stored grain produce tetracycline naturally, and grain kept in a warm climate, then brewed or baked, can carry it straight into the body. Whether they understood exactly what they were doing is a genuinely open question. What isn't in question is the effect. The bones show the drug, and rates of certain infections in that population look unusually low. Now put that next to the moldy bread that shows up again and again in old healing traditions, pressed onto wounds by people who were told for the next few centuries that they were filthy and superstitious for doing it. The mold was doing something. It just took us until the 1920s to look at it through the right lens and win a Nobel Prize for noticing. Your ancestors were living inside a pharmacy they couldn't read the labels of. They read the results instead. Think about what that means for the story we tell ourselves. The discovery of antibiotics gets described as a bolt from nowhere, a lucky accident on a laboratory bench. It was really a moment when someone finally worked out the mechanism behind something people had been stumbling into and using for a very long time. And that brings us to the one that makes people physically wince. Someone hits their head. Not badly at first. They get up, they talk, then hours later, they stop making sense. And one pupil blows wide, and they slip somewhere you can't follow. What's happening inside is simple and merciless. Blood is pooling in a space that has nowhere to expand, and the pressure is crushing the brain against the inside of the skull. Without intervention, that person dies every time. So your ancestors picked up a sharpened stone and cut a hole in the bone. This is trepanation, and it's one of the oldest surgeries we know of, turning up on every inhabited continent, in skulls thousands of years old. For a long time, the assumption was obvious. Ritual, superstition, letting out demons, butchery dressed up as medicine. Then someone looked at the edges. Bone heals. When a person survives an injury, the edges of the hole smooth over and grow, and that growth is unmistakable under examination. And in skull after skull after skull, the holes had healed. Not a few. In some collections, most of them. These people lived, some of them long enough for the opening to nearly close. Sit with that. In some prehistoric groups, the survival rate for having your skull deliberately opened was better than the survival rate for the same procedure in European hospitals during parts of the 1800s, when surgeons were going from corpse to patient without washing their hands. And the technique itself shows someone thinking. In many cases, they didn't stab or hammer through the bone. They scraped, slowly, grinding a shallow bowl into the skull and working down layer by layer, which is the safest possible way to do it without a way to see what's underneath. Others cut a careful groove in a circle and lifted the disc of bone out whole. The tool marks show patience, not panic. Some skulls even show a second opening made years later in a person who'd already survived the first one, which means they went back for more, and so did the surgeon. There's a question you're probably asking, and the honest answer is that we don't fully know. Almost certainly they had something. Plants that dull pain and slow the mind grow in most of the places where trepanation shows up. And in some regions, the connection between the surgery and those plants is hard to miss. And the reason it worked is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Releasing pressure inside the skull is not a superstition. It's the correct response. Today, it's called a craniotomy, and a neurosurgeon will perform one on a bleeding brain in a modern operating theater for the same reason, with the same goal. We didn't invent that idea. We inherited it, sterilized it, and pretended it was new. So if they understood the inside of the head, what did they understand about the outside? You're moving across open ground in high sun, and there's no shade and no cloth to cover you. Burn badly enough out here, and the damage isn't cosmetic. Blistered skin is broken skin, and broken skin lets infection in. So before leaving, you coat yourself in red. Ochre is one of the most common finds in ancient human sites anywhere on Earth. Ground, mixed, carried enormous distances, sometimes mined out of the ground in quantities that only make sense if people needed it constantly. For a long time, the standard explanation was decoration and ceremony. Here's the problem with that explanation. When researchers actually tested ochre pastes, they found the stuff blocks ultraviolet light. It works. Rub the right mixture on skin and you have a functioning physical sunscreen, the same basic principle as the mineral sunblocks sold today. It also appears to help against insects, and it changes the properties of the skin's surface. There's more. Ochre turns up as an ingredient in ancient glue recipes, where adding it to plant resin changes how the mixture sets and how well a stone point stays fixed to a shaft. That's not paint, that's material science, worked out by trial and error over generations. So the picture we had of ancient people covering themselves in red for a ceremony was never wrong, exactly. It was just badly incomplete. It's also entirely possible to do something because it's meaningful and because it stops your skin from cooking. And there's one more thing that gives it away, which is effort. People hauled this stuff over huge distances and dug it out of hillsides in amounts that make no sense for occasional decoration. When a group with no carts and no roads decides to carry heavy rock across a landscape, that rock is doing a job. We looked at the most practical technology in the toolkit and called it jewelry. You've got more meat than your group can eat, and there's no fire hot enough, no salt, no ice, and no way to keep it. In 3 days, it starts to turn. In 5, it smells like death. So you bury it, not to hide it, to let it change. In cold ground, in a bog, under stones, sealed away from air, and left there. What comes out weeks later would empty a modern restaurant in seconds. It's sour, it's soft, and it's pungent enough to make your eyes sting. It's also safe, and in some ways better than what went in. What's happening under the ground is a controlled takeover. The right microbes in the right conditions produce acid, and that acid makes the environment hostile to the organisms that cause dangerous spoilage. They colonize the food and then defend it. Fermentation also breaks down tissue in advance, which makes it easier to digest, and it can generate vitamins that weren't in the fresh meat at all. And this is not a forgiving process. Get the conditions wrong. Wrong temperature, wrong seal, wrong container, and instead of preserved food, you get one of the deadliest toxins on Earth, produced by an organism that thrives in exactly the airless conditions you just created. Communities that did this successfully were following rules that had been refined over an enormous span of time, and those rules were not optional, which is precisely why the knowledge was guarded, taught, and repeated the same way every year. Ancient people didn't just tolerate this, they engineered it. Fermented fish, fermented meat, buried and aged and eaten deliberately from the Arctic to the tropics in cultures with no contact between them. For a long stretch of the modern era, this was treated as evidence of desperation, proof that people would eat anything before they starved. Then, supermarkets started charging premium prices for aged cheese, cured sausage, kimchi, miso, sourdough, and yogurt, and the world quietly rebranded the exact same process as a delicacy. Rot is only the enemy when you don't control it. Your ancestors learned to point it in a direction. Back to your body one last time, because there's one more thing in the kit, and it might be the oldest of all. A deep cut needs to be closed and protected. Left open, it stays wet, and wet is where infection lives. So someone reaches for a lump of dark, tarry material and works it warm between their hands. It's birch bark tar, made by heating bark under controlled conditions until it gives up a thick black resin. It sticks to almost anything, sets hard, and holds a stone blade to a wooden handle better than anything else available for most of human history. Neanderthals were making it, not finding it, making it, through a process that requires managing heat carefully over time, long before modern humans arrived in Europe. And here's what modern testing found in these resins and pitches. Many of them are naturally antimicrobial. The tree produces them as a defense against the exact kinds of organisms that attack a wound, and that property doesn't vanish when the resin is on your skin instead of the tree's. Coating a wound in resin gives you a barrier that keeps dirt out, holds the edges together, and actively discourages the things trying to get in. There are people today buying wound sealants and antiseptic barrier films at a pharmacy, and the underlying idea is not new. It's around 200,000 years old. And the first person to work it out had a brow ridge and a brain slightly larger than yours. So that's 10. Maggots, honey, willow, clay, fat, mold, trepanation, ochre, fermentation, resin, all of them dismissed, most of them mocked, several of them pushed out of medicine entirely, which leaves the only question that actually matters. Why did we throw them away? The comfortable answer is that science replaced them with something better. And mostly that's true. Nobody should trade a modern antibiotic for a handful of clay. Any honest version of this story has to say that clearly. But that's not the whole reason. And the rest of the reason is uglier. For a long stretch of history, a very specific idea took hold, that the past was primitive, that people without writing were people without understanding, and that anything done by hand in the dirt could not possibly be as good as something done by a trained man in a clean room. That idea was so strong that it stopped being a hypothesis and started being a filter. Treatments weren't tested and rejected, they were looked at, found disgusting, and dropped. The maggots weren't beaten by evidence, they were beaten by revulsion. The honey wasn't disproven, it was embarrassing. The clay, the marrow, the resin, the mold, none of them lost an argument. They lost a fashion contest. And here's the part that should stay with you after this video ends. Every single one of those methods came from a source we don't respect and can't reproduce. Hundreds of thousands of years of people trying things while their lives depended on the outcome. No control group, no funding, just an unbroken chain of survivors passing down the small number of things that actually worked. Because everyone who got it wrong stopped being an ancestor. That's not folklore. That's the largest and longest trial ever run on human beings. And you are holding its results in your body right now. And it was fragile in a way we've almost forgotten. None of it was written anywhere. All of it lived inside people. Which tree, which clay bank, how long to leave the meat, how much bark is too much. When an old woman in a small group died before she'd finished teaching someone, a piece of that knowledge died with her. And it might take another 1,000 years for anyone to work it out again. Every one of these 10 things survived a gauntlet that most discoveries in human history did not. The reason you flinch at rotten meat is that trial. The reason you crave fat is that trial. The reason a bitter taste makes you stop chewing is that trial. Your instincts are the summary at the end of a study nobody wrote down. Your ancestors couldn't see bacteria, couldn't name a chemical, and couldn't read a single word. They still figured out how to pull poison out of food, close a wound, break a fever, drain the pressure off a dying brain, and turn rot into a food supply. We spent 100 years calling that ignorance. Now we're buying it back, one approved treatment at a time, and putting our own names on the label. So go back to that leg, the cut, the smell, the woman leaning over you with something alive in her hands. You know now that she's right. But ask yourself honestly whether you'd have let her do it, sitting there with your modern stomach and your modern certainty about what's clean and what isn't. That hesitation is the whole lesson. Not that old things are better, that being disgusted by something has never once been the same as understanding it. They kept the human race alive with mud, bark, insects, and fat. And if they'd been even slightly worse at it, there'd be nobody here to laugh at them. If you liked the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you guys in the next one.